Look, as landscape photographers, we spend hours looking and planning for how to photograph the best light in the landscape. So we know how to do that in the field. Why not know exactly how to do that in post-processing? In this video, we're going to cover 5 tips in Lightroom that are going to help you maximize your photos using light in Lightroom. You know, I hate to use the phrase like make or break, but light truly is one of those things in landscape photography when it's there, it makes a photograph. Like if you go to a great location and you have okay light, it's probably going to be an okay photo. So if you have great light in a great location, it's going to be one of those huge, just epic scenes that you can photograph. But that light really isn't accentuated until you do it in Lightroom and get into the software and really know how to play around with that great light that you spent hours looking for and then photographing in the field. This is that final step of bringing it out before you print, before you share, whatever you want to do with your photos. So let's jump into Lightroom and discover these. Number 1 is going to be histogram analyzation and just knowing what your light is doing in the photograph. So we can look at the histogram in Lightroom and discover where our light is, what it's doing, how it's acting, because it's not always easy to see that with our eyes. We have to go into the histogram and really look at that data and analyze it, where it is and how it's acting within our photograph. So in this image that we're going to be editing today is just a really moody, dramatic waterfall in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. If you want to see the behind the scenes footage of photographing this waterfall, you can click or tap the card that's showing up on your screen right now, or in the video description below, I've provided a link for you to that video as well if you want to look that up later. So we can look at the histogram and you'll see it's pushed way to the left. Now on the histogram, on the very far side are blacks. Right here in the histogram are going to be your shadows. In the middle are your midtones. In the right side are your highlights, and on the very far right side are your whites. Now, in a lot of the image data, you want to kind of steer away from any data touching the left or right side of the histogram completely. You'll see we have a lot of that in this image. But that's okay for me in this image because I have a very moody scene with a lot of deep black shadows. I kind of want that coming through. So one trick you can do is hit your J key, and what it will show you are highlights of where you have anything that's touching the far left side of the histogram, which is where you have no image data and it's completely black. Or if we had anything touching the right side of the histogram, like if I pulled my exposure all the way up, the highlights of red are where I have completely white data and I have no image data in that part. So blue are complete blacks and red are complete whites. So I'm just going to double click my exposure and bring that back down. So that's a good indicator of what our light is doing here, because it's really hard to see on the histogram, like, okay, I probably have something touching there, but where is it? Now I know exactly where that data is coming from, and I know if I zoom in here, you know, I may be able to find some other areas of complete blacks that, you know, up in here in these cracks in the rocks, and maybe in here on the shrubs on the far left side. You know, that's okay. What I'm worried about is that I don't have any of that information showing up in my main subject. This is really just complementary, and it's allowing me to photograph this image and bring more attention to the waterfall itself. So I'm fine with that. So I'm going to hit my J key to undo that. Knowing where your light is occurring in your image is paramount for the next steps that we take. So step 2 in playing with light in Lightroom is mood. What do you want to do with your mood in the image? Now this image that we have here that we're working on is a very dark, like moody, peaceful scene, and I want to keep it that way. But in other images, we want a really bright and fun and light mood. And knowing which mood you want before you start making these edits will help you. You know, if I wanted to make this a little bit more moody, which is probably what I'm going to do, I can play with my temperature in this light and decrease my temperature to a more blue and moody scene. Whereas if I wanted it more like fun and energetic, I would probably have it a little bit more warm and have it on that side of the temperature. You know, tint is there also to balance out your mood. So if I have this a little bit more blue and moody, I may increase, you know, my tint to a little bit more magenta to try to decrease the amount of green that's going on in my image, and just playing with my temperature and my tint in my light, in my image with Lightroom is going to help me accentuate the mood of my photograph. So deciding that when you're out in the field, whether you're photographing this or when you bring this into Lightroom and saying, hey, this is kind of like a darker scene, it's kind of like a more moody photo, or this is more of a warm scene, I kind of want to warm this up and create more yellow tones, that's going to help you in Lightroom develop your mood and really set the foundation and groundwork for your photo edit. So now that I do have my mood adjusted, I've created cooler tones and a little bit more magenta tint to this photograph. What I want to do is make global adjustments, and that's tip number 3 for this list on how to use light in Lightroom. And what I mean by that is using global adjustments that are going to impact the entire photograph. You know, I want to bring out the light detail before I move on to the rest of the tips in this list. Is I want to build on that foundation. We've set the mood, we know what light is doing in our image. Now we want to make adjustments and really start to accentuate that. So globally, and global edits are edits that impact the entire photograph, are going to be like contrast and highlights and shadows, whites and blacks, clarity. So what I'm trying to do is stretch more detail out of that histogram. So I have a lot pushed to the left. I want to bring out more of the details that are in my shadows, midtones, highlights. And I want to bring those out a little bit more. So I've increased my highlights here. I may increase my shadows a little bit to bring more detail out of those. And what I can do is zoom in on this rock right here and kind of watch, because I do have highlights and shadows together right here, which we'll be impacting a little bit later. But I basically want to bring up my shadows until I see just a little bit of detail on those. I'm going to do the same thing with my whites on that. Also watching the waterfall and what I'm doing with this light as well. And then increasing my blacks just slightly too, to bring up a little bit more detail in that. So I'm going to zoom back out and see what I've done here. Looks a little bit brighter, and we've brought out some more detail in the shadows, but I'm also going to increase my clarity in this photograph and bring out a little bit more. And that looks pretty good, somewhere around 24. Just creating more detail overall in this image with the clarity slider is going to help me later bring out more detail in my highlights and shadows and playing with that light. And then lastly, with the light that we have, what I want to do is bring out some more like vibrance in that. We have a lot of greens, which vibrance is fantastic for. So I'm going to pull vibrance up, and then I'm also going to pull saturation up a little bit. Now, for this photograph, what I don't want is those adjustments to vibrance and saturation to impact my mood of this photograph. So somewhere along the way, you have to decide, have my edits kind of reverted back to what I didn't want in the mood of this. So I can scroll back up to my temperature and my tint and work on those. So I'm just going to decrease that temperature and increase the tint a little bit. The data and the color of the saturation is going to stay the same. We're just dealing with temperature and tint now. So now that I've gotten it back to a more moody scene, we can move on to tip number 4, which is dodging and burning. Now, photographers hold backlight to lighten an area on the print, or dodging, or increase the exposure to darken areas on a print, which is burning. And this was especially popular when photographers developed their own prints from film. I've seen videos on Ansel Adams doing the same thing, and it's absolutely fascinating the way they use different slides over their prints to shadow some areas and bring out more light on others. Fascinating stuff. We're doing the same thing digitally in this image. So what I'm going to do is create more localized adjustments, and I'm going to bring out more detail in my highlights and my shadows on this, dodging and burning these. So what I'm going to do is work first with my shadows. So I'm just going to paint in a decreased exposure here with my adjustment brush. And this is the adjustment brush up here in the top right corner of your screen. You can also hit the K key on your keyboard to bring up that adjustment brush if you want a keyboard shortcut for that. So I'm also just gonna paint this in, and I'm just looking for these shadowed areas, and specifically shadow areas that are right next to like really highlighted areas. And what this is gonna do is allow us to pull more detail and separation out of this image between my highlights and my shadows. So I'm just kind of finding those haphazardly through this image, and I'm gonna double click on my exposure to bring that back up. But what I'm gonna do is actually decrease my shadows a little bit and then increase my contrast on that, making those a little bit darker. I may decrease my shadows a little bit more, and then I'm also gonna increase clarity on those specific adjustments just barely. So those, if you want to see exactly where you've painted on that, you can click on this little button right here and it'll highlight red everywhere we've made that adjustment. And that helps us see, okay, now that I've dealt with my shadows here, now I can do the same thing with my highlights and just increase my highlights on that adjustment brush painting. So what I'm gonna do is go to New up here under the adjustment brush, and I'm still going to have the exposure decrease just so I can see where I'm painting, but I'm just gonna find my highlighted areas and I'm just gonna paint those in. So basically the highlights on these rocks right here that kind of dip down. And if you remember, we did decrease some of the shadows in the trees too. So I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna paint in some of these highlighted areas in the trees. I'm just gonna kind of make big sweeps here to the overall highlighted tree limbs that are coming in, that are just gonna stand out from those shadowed sections. So that looks pretty good. I'm gonna double click on my exposure to bring that back up. And then with my highlight slider, I'm gonna increase those highlights and just bring out a lot more detail. So basically what we're doing here is saying highlights against shadows, bring out more separation and make those stand out a little bit more, because that's the moody light that we are photographing in this image, accentuating that of why we actually shot it in the field. So that looks pretty good. I'm also gonna increase clarity some on this localized adjustment here. And this doesn't have to be some huge edit that we're making. These are very subtle adjustments to light that we have in Lightroom that are gonna bring out a lot more detail in our photograph and just add that little extra bit of pop to our images. And then finally, number 5 is using the luminance sliders to our advantage to play with light. You know, the luminance sliders are going to allow us to select out just my green highlights on this and lighten those up a little bit. So that's going to be the last step that I'm taking in this image. So I'm going to scroll down to my HSL sliders, which are hue, saturation, and luminance. And I'm just going to work on the luminance sliders here. So I'm going to take green and I'm just going to pop that up to add just a little bit more detail. And if I slide this up pretty quick, you can see like the little bit of impact that that has. I just want like really, really subtle impact on this. And I also may bring up blue on this just to make that waterfall pop a little bit. If you pull it up, you can see that it just adds a little bit more hint of color and light to that. And we really had like this light beam coming in on here, hitting the rocks, hitting the waterfall, and then everything else behind it just kind of falls silent into the back. So that's the last step. Here's the finished photo that we've worked on and edited. I can show you before and after here. And you can see that we've created a more like deeper, moodier photograph instead of a warm image. We brought out a ton more detail and distance between our highlights and shadows and the back with the trees, and also on the rocks here. Like we can have so much more detail coming in where we did have like in the waterfall portion here, you can see brighter, lighter. We've increased the light on this, we've decreased the shadows, but we've kept the detail in the rocks. And that's the overall goal of this, is using what we know with our light in the field and why we photographed it in the first place, and then coming back with our steps and knowledge in Lightroom and how to edit those and bring those out and create really professional, nice looking photographs using what we know about light to our advantage.